In August 1961, Berlin woke to barbed wire and soldiers. Overnight, a city split. This is when a wall split a country in two, the story of how a concrete barrier became the Cold War's starkest symbol. We trace its roots from post-war Germany's division at Potsdam, through the Berlin Blockade, the birth of East and West Germany, and a migration crisis that drained the East. Walter Ulbricht denied plans for a wall until it rose. Fences, slabs, towers, a death strip. Families were divided. Some tunneled or flew to escape. The wall was also global theater. Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner, Reagan's tear down this wall, until protests and a press conference blunder opened the gates on November 9, 1989. Reunification brought promise and strain, and Berlin's fragments now stand as reminders. From the Korean DMZ to Cyprus, its lessons echo. Walls do more than block paths, they shape lives. The summer air in Berlin was still and heavy. On the night of August 12, 1961, families on both sides of the city went to bed as usual. At first light on August 13th, something had changed. Soldiers and police stood in long lines, rolling out barbed wire. Trucks rumbled through the streets. Concrete posts went into the ground. What had been streets and sidewalks hours before were now blocked. People stared in disbelief. In some places, a neighbor's house was just meters away, yet now unreachable. For years before that morning, Berlin had been a doorway. The city lay in the middle of East Germany, but its western half was tied to West Germany and the wider West. East Germans unhappy with life under the communist government could walk into West Berlin and from there travel to West Germany. It was an escape route, and millions used it. By 1961, the East German state was losing thousands of skilled workers and young people each week. The leadership feared collapse. The decision to close the border came from the top. Walter Ulbricht, leader of East Germany, received backing from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Their aim was to stop the flow of people and protect their control. The East German government claimed it was a defensive measure to keep out spies and stop fascist elements. Most people knew the real reason. The wall was to keep citizens in. The first barrier was not yet a wall. It was coils of barbed wire, wooden barricades, and hastily dug trenches. Streets were cut in two. Railway lines ended abruptly. Families woke to find they could no longer cross to work, school, or church. In some cases, people could see loved ones across the street, but could not reach them. In the following weeks, the wire was replaced with concrete slabs, reinforced with guard towers and floodlights. The Berlin Wall became more than 150 kilometers long, surrounding West Berlin entirely. Guards patrolled the wall with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. The death strip, a wide-open zone between inner and outer walls, was raked flat so footprints would show. Sand or gravel made it harder to run. Dogs were kept on long wires. Watchtowers gave soldiers a clear view. The message was simple: crossing was not allowed. Despite the risk, many tried to escape. Some tunneled under the wall. Others used forged papers to slip through checkpoints. In the early days, a few jumped from buildings whose windows looked into West Berlin before authorities bricked them up. The stories of failed attempts were grim. People were shot in sight of crowds. Rescue was rare. Even when someone reached the wall, guards often arrived first. The wall split more than a city. It cut through families, friendships, and lives. A grandmother in the East might never again hug her grandchildren in the West. Couples were forced apart. Parents died without seeing their children again. Every decision to try crossing was weighed against the risk of death and the certainty of punishment for anyone left behind. The West responded with outrage. Leaders like U.S. President John F. Kennedy called the wall a sign of the failure of communism. Yet, they did not take it down. In the tense balance of the Cold War, the wall became a grim but stable fact. It was better, in their eyes, than the risk of open conflict with the Soviet Union. Life on each side moved in different directions. West Berlin, supported by West Germany and Western allies, developed into a lively, modern city. Its shops were stocked, its streets busy, and its culture open. East Berlin remained under strict state control. Goods were limited, dissent was punished, and movement was tightly monitored. Propaganda claimed the East was building a better society, but the wall itself told another story. Checkpoint Charlie became the most famous crossing point. Allied soldiers stood watch on one side, East German guards on the other. Foreign visitors could pass more easily than East Germans, and tourists often came to see the wall for themselves. Photographs of the checkpoint, with its stark signs warning, "You are leaving the American sector," traveled around the world. The wall was more than a physical barrier. It was a symbol of the Cold War itself. Two systems, two ideologies, facing each other with deep mistrust. East and West Germany were the front line of a global divide between communist states and capitalist democracies. Berlin, once a single city, became the sharpest point of that divide. Other parts of the world had their own barriers. In Korea, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, split the peninsula into North and South after the Korean War. There, too, families were divided, and crossing was almost impossible. In Cyprus, a buffer zone divided Greek and Turkish communities. In the Middle East, security fences and walls separated Israeli and Palestinian areas. Each of these borders, like the Berlin Wall, was built in the name of security but carried heavy human cost. Walls can stop movement, but they cannot erase memory or desire. In Berlin, the wall became a backdrop to daily life, but it never felt natural. People adapted, yet the absence of freedom was constant. School lessons, workplace meetings, and even casual talks at home were shaped by the knowledge that the state watched and listened. To speak of escape was to invite danger. Still, rumors of successful crossings fed quiet hope. The wall's presence also shaped politics far beyond Berlin. It gave the West a clear example of repression to point to in speeches and media. For the East, it was proof of their resolve to hold power. In a world tense with the threat of nuclear war, the wall stood as a warning of what was at stake if the Cold War turned hot. On both sides, children grew up knowing the wall as part of the landscape. For those in the East, it was something to avoid, a place where danger lived. For those in the West, it was something to look at, a reminder of the city's split. Soldiers and guards became part of that scenery, their uniforms and weapons blending into the sense of normality, even as they enforced a system built on separation. In this way, the wall worked as both a practical barrier and a psychological one. It told East Berliners that leaving was impossible. It told West Berliners that return for friends and family was hopeless. The open city of the post-war years was gone, replaced by a border that, unlike most, ran through the heart of a living city. In the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May. Its cities lay in ruins, its people displaced, and its government destroyed. The Allies, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain met in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, to decide what to do with the defeated country. France would join the occupation later, but the key talks were held between leaders Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee after an election in Britain. The meeting was formal, but its stakes were high. Germany's future would shape the peace in Europe, or the lack of it. The Allies agreed to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the victorious powers. The Americans, British, and later the French took the western part of the country. The Soviets controlled the east. Berlin, although deep inside the Soviet zone, was itself split into 4 sectors. This arrangement was meant to be temporary. The Allies planned to govern Germany jointly, dismantle the Nazi system, and rebuild the country as a peaceful state. Berlin's position made it unusual. Over 150 kilometers from the nearest Western-controlled territory, the city's western sectors were islands surrounded by Soviet-controlled land. In 1945, this seemed manageable. Trains, roads, and canals connected Berlin to the west, and Soviet authorities promised access would remain open. The idea was that, as Germany was rebuilt, the Allies would work together and eventually hand power back to a German government. At first, there was some cooperation. Allied officers met to coordinate the distribution of food, the repair of transport, and the arrest of Nazi officials. War criminals were put on trial at Nuremberg. The Allies agreed on the need for demilitarization and denazification. Public buildings reopened. Schools resumed classes with new curricula stripped of Nazi ideology. This gave the impression of a common purpose, at least in public statements. But beneath the surface, differences were already showing. The Soviet Union had suffered huge losses during the war. Its cities and farms were destroyed, and millions of its people were dead. Stalin wanted to make sure Germany could never again invade the Soviet Union. His approach was to keep Germany weak, take reparations, and use its resources to rebuild the Soviet economy. The United States and Britain saw things differently. They feared that a weak Germany would create instability, famine, and unrest, which could make it easier for communism to spread. Their aim was to rebuild Germany's economy so it could become self-sufficient and a trading partner in Europe. These goals clashed, and the cracks in Allied unity widened. In Berlin, these differences became visible in everyday life. In the Soviet sector, authorities moved quickly to create a system based on one-party control. Political groups were merged into a single socialist unity party, dominated by communists. Land reform broke up large estates, redistributing land to small farmers, but often under state direction. Press freedom was restricted. In the Western sectors, political life was more open. Multiple parties competed, newspapers had broader freedom, and local leaders could speak against occupation policies. Trade unions were rebuilt with more independence. Economic policy in the West aimed at restoring private enterprise, while in the East, industry was nationalized and placed under state control. The currency became a major point of conflict. By 1948, the Western Allies introduced the Deutsche Mark in their zones to stabilize the economy. The Soviets opposed this move, seeing it as a step toward creating a separate West German state. In response, they cut off road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies out. This led to the Berlin Airlift, in which American and British planes flew in food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year until the blockade was lifted. The Potsdam Conference had not created this division on purpose. Its agreements were broad and open to interpretation. Each side acted according to its own vision for Germany, and mistrust grew quickly. The Soviets saw Western policies as attempts to undermine socialism and gain influence in Eastern Europe. The West saw Soviet actions as steps toward imposing communist control beyond the agreed zones. This mistrust was fed by events outside Germany as well. In Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia came under Soviet influence, with communist governments installed and opposition silenced. In the West, the United States launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild European economies, but the Soviets rejected it and forbade Eastern Bloc countries from joining. Berlin remained a flashpoint because it contained both systems side by side. In one city, residents could compare wages, food supplies, and political freedoms. A worker could visit a relative across the sector border and see the contrast firsthand. For the Soviets, this was dangerous. For the West, it was a way to show the benefits of their system. Even in 1945, the seeds of this division were present. The Potsdam Agreements had sketched a shared framework, but the details were left to each occupying power. The Allies never developed a single, unified plan for Germany's future. The idea of a joint administration gave way to separate administrations. The military governors in each zone answered to their own governments, not to a central authority. The mood in Berlin reflected the larger global change from wartime alliance to Cold War rivalry. The trust that had existed, limited though it was, during the fight against Nazi Germany, faded quickly. Stalin no longer needed to accommodate Western demands once the common enemy was gone. Truman was less willing than Roosevelt to make concessions to the Soviet Union. Churchill had warned as early as 1946 that an iron curtain was descending across Europe, a phrase that captured the growing reality. Ordinary Germans experienced these changes in practical ways. A Berlin shopkeeper might have to deal with 4 different sets of rules, depending on where goods came from. A student might attend classes in one sector but live in another, crossing a border each day. At first, these crossings were open, but they became points of tension. Soviet guards might question people more closely. Western officials might tighten their own controls in response. The Potsdam Conference was the last time the major Allied leaders met as partners with the shared task of shaping Germany's post-war future. After that, every decision about Germany became part of a larger contest between 2 political and economic systems. In this contest, Berlin was not just a city. It was the stage on which both sides acted out their visions for Europe, with the rest of the world watching. In June 1948, tensions in Berlin reached a breaking point. The Western Allies had introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, into their zones to stabilize the economy. The Soviet Union saw this as a direct challenge and a step toward creating a separate West German state. In response, Soviet forces cut all road, rail, and canal links to West Berlin. The aim was clear: force the Western Allies to abandon their sectors of the city. If West Berlin could not be supplied, it would starve into submission. The blockade trapped more than 2 million people in the western sectors. Food, fuel, and medicine were all in short supply. The Western Allies refused to back down. Instead of fighting their way through, they turned to the air. The Berlin airlift began within days. Cargo planes flew in supplies from West Germany, landing every few minutes at Tempelhof, Gatow, and later Tegel airfields. Crews brought flour, coal, powdered milk, medical equipment, and more. The scale of the effort was enormous. At its peak, planes landed in West Berlin every 30 seconds. Children came to watch and called the planes raisin bombers when pilots dropped small sweets and treats attached to handkerchief parachutes. The operation ran through rain, snow, and ice. Mechanics worked in freezing hangars to keep the aircraft flying. By the spring of 1949, the airlift had proven the blockade would not succeed. The Soviets lifted it in May, but the political damage was done. The airlift showed the Western commitment to Berlin. It also deepened the split between East and West. Within months, two German states emerged. In May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, known as West Germany, was founded from the three Western zones. It adopted a democratic constitution, held free elections, and aligned itself with the United States, Britain, and France. In October, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, was declared in the Soviet zone. It was a socialist state under the control of the Socialist Unity Party, backed by Moscow. From that point on, the two Germanys developed in different directions. In the West, economic aid from the Marshall Plan helped rebuild industry and infrastructure. Cities were repaired, businesses reopened, and consumer goods returned to the shops. In the East, reconstruction followed a centralized state-run model. Factories were nationalized, large farms became collective enterprises, and political opposition was suppressed. Both sides fought for legitimacy, not only within Germany, but also on the world stage. West German leaders argued they represented the whole German nation and would work toward peaceful reunification under democratic rule. East German leaders claimed they had built the first true German workers' state, free of capitalist exploitation. Propaganda was central to these claims. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newspapers portrayed the other side as corrupt or dangerous. In the West, stories of repression and shortages in the East filled the headlines. In the East, Western society was depicted as greedy, unequal, and dominated by foreign powers. Berlin, still divided into four sectors, became the main stage for this propaganda war. The city was one of the few places where East Germans could see Western goods and culture firsthand. Western television and radio signals reached far into the East, carrying music, news, and political debate. In public squares, people gathered to listen to foreign broadcasts on smuggled radios. The authorities in the East tried to block these signals, but with limited success. The open border in Berlin also created a major problem for the GDR. People could leave. Between 1949 and 1961, around 3 million East Germans fled to the West, most through Berlin. Some crossed directly from East to West Berlin by subway or tram. Others walked across streets where the sector boundary was marked only by a sign. Once in West Berlin, they could travel to West Germany and start a new life. Many who left were young and well-educated. Doctors, engineers, teachers, and skilled factory workers made up a large share of the migration. Their departure weakened the East German economy. Factories lost trained staff, hospitals lost surgeons, schools lost experienced teachers. The government could not easily replace them. In some towns, entire work teams disappeared in a single week. This exodus also had a political cost. Every departure was a public rejection of the GDR. The leadership in East Berlin feared that if the trend continued, the state itself might collapse. They tried to slow the flow with new laws. Travel permits were harder to get. People were questioned about their reasons for visiting the West. Border guards received more training and better equipment. Yet the border inside Berlin stayed open, and people kept leaving. In some cases, the departures were dramatic. Families carried only what they could hold and left at night to avoid attention. University students finished exams in the east and boarded trains to the west the same day. Workers crossed the sector boundary during lunch breaks and never returned. The stories spread quickly, encouraging others to follow. The GDR government launched campaigns to discourage leaving. Posters showed supposed failures of life in the West: unemployment, homelessness, and crime. State media accused those who fled of betraying their homeland. Employers were told to watch for signs that workers might plan to leave, such as selling possessions or requesting time off. Still, the numbers grew. By the late 1950s, the problem became urgent. The East German economy was struggling to meet production targets. Skilled labor shortages delayed industrial projects. The education system could not train replacements fast enough. At the same time, the Western economy was booming, making the contrast sharper. In Berlin, West German shops displayed new clothes, radios, and household goods in windows just meters from East German streets where such items were scarce. The Soviet Union, watching from Moscow, was concerned. East Germany was its most important ally in Central Europe, a frontline state in the Cold War. Soviet leaders worried that the loss of workers and professionals threatened the GDR's stability. They pressed East German leader Walter Ulbricht to find a solution. By 1961, more than 1,000 East Germans were leaving each day, most through Berlin. Trains and buses from East Berlin to West Berlin were full. Stations became informal meeting points for those about to leave, with friends and family seeing them off for what might be a final goodbye. Some left quietly, telling no one to avoid suspicion. Others made public farewells, turning their departure into an act of protest. The scale of the migration was not only an economic crisis, but also a public relations disaster for the East. It showed the world that given the choice, many East Germans preferred life in the West. The leadership feared that if the flow continued, it would undermine their claims of building a better state. In closed meetings, officials discussed measures to close the Berlin border completely. The open city that had survived the blockade and airlift was about to face a new barrier, one that would change Berlin forever. In the summer of 1961, the East German government faced a crisis it could no longer ignore. Every day, thousands of people crossed from East to West Berlin. Many never returned. Skilled workers, students, and entire families were leaving. The loss was draining the economy and embarrassing the state. Walter Ulbricht, the leader of East Germany, had been under pressure from Moscow to stop the flow. Yet only weeks before the border closed, he stood before reporters and said, "No one has the intention of building a wall." His words were meant to calm public speculation, but for many, they now seem like a deliberate deception. On the night of August 12, 1961, the city changed. East German police, soldiers, and construction crews moved into position. They worked in silence at first, then the noise of hammers, engines, and trucks filled the streets. Barbed wire was unrolled along the sector border. Side streets were blocked, railway lines were cut, checkpoints were shut without warning. By dawn on August 13th, Berliners woke to find them on one side or the other, with no way across. In some neighborhoods, the new barrier ran directly down streets, cutting off friends and relatives. People stood at the wire and shouted to each other, some in disbelief, others in anger. In a few places, desperate residents jumped from windows into the west before guards sealed the buildings. The sudden change left many stunned. A man who worked in West Berlin but lived in the east could not reach his job. A grandmother who planned to visit her family in the west found herself separated indefinitely. The first barrier was crude, just barbed wire and wooden posts, but it served its purpose. Within days, the wire gave way to a more solid fence. Roads leading to the border were dug up or blocked by concrete obstacles. Armed guards patrolled constantly. Over the next months and years, the fortifications grew. Wire fences became concrete walls. The border gained a second inner wall, a clear death strip, floodlights, guard towers, and patrol roads. The wall became a permanent fixture, designed to stop not only cars and trains, but also any person on foot. Checkpoint Charlie became the most famous crossing point between East and West Berlin. Located in the American sector, it was the main route for foreign diplomats, military personnel, and tourists. For East Germans, it was closed except in rare cases of official business. Signs in English, Russian, French, and German warned travelers that they were about to leave the American sector. In October 1961, just 2 months after the wall went up, Checkpoint Charlie became the stage for one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. The incident began when an American diplomat tried to cross into East Berlin without showing his papers to East German guards. The United States recognized only the authority of the Soviet Union in Berlin, not the East German government, and refused to submit to East German controls. Soviet and East German officials saw this as a challenge. The dispute escalated quickly. U.S. tanks rolled up to the checkpoint, their guns pointed toward the east. Soon, Soviet tanks appeared on the other side, matching the American line. Soldiers waited inside, engines running. For 16 hours, the two sides faced each other across the narrow crossing, just a few meters apart. Any sudden move could have triggered a firefight in the middle of the city. People in nearby buildings watched from windows, aware that even a small mistake could spark a larger conflict. Journalists crowded the area, sending photographs around the world. The standoff was a visible reminder that Berlin was more than a divided city. It was a front line in the struggle between two nuclear-armed powers. Back-channel negotiations eventually eased the tension. Orders came for the tanks to pull back, one by one. The Soviets moved first, then the Americans. By the end of the day, the checkpoint returned to its usual guarded stillness, but the message was clear. Berlin could become the spark for a much wider war, and both sides knew it. While the tank standoff ended without shots fired, life along the wall settled into a grim routine. Guards continued to fortify the barrier, replacing sections with higher and stronger concrete. Watchtowers went up at regular intervals, giving soldiers a clear view of the death strip. Floodlights illuminated the area at night. The space between the inner and outer walls was raked flat so footprints would be visible. Patrol dogs ran along wire runs, and tripwires triggered alarms. Escape became much more dangerous. In the first days after August 13th, some managed to slip through gaps or use ladders. Once the fortifications hardened, only the most determined and resourceful could attempt a crossing. People dug tunnels, hid in modified vehicles, or floated across waterways under cover of darkness. Many were caught, some were killed. Families grieved in private, unable to speak openly about what had happened. Checkpoint Charlie remained a symbol of the divide. For Western visitors, it was a place to look into the east, to see the guard towers and the wall up close. For those in the east, it was a reminder of what they could not reach. The checkpoint was also a stage for propaganda. The West used it to show the limits placed on East Germans, the armed guards, and the physical barrier to freedom. The East portrayed it as a defense against Western interference and espionage. The events of August 1961 marked the end of Berlin as an open city. The wall stopped the flow of people from east to west almost overnight. For the East German leadership, it was a political victory. For those trapped on the eastern side, it was a sudden and lasting loss. In the streets, the daily crossings, casual visits, and shared spaces that had connected the city were gone. The barbed wire that appeared overnight had been replaced by concrete, but the separation it created was the same, immediate, unyielding, and absolute. The Berlin Wall was more than a single barrier. It was two parallel walls running through and around the city, enclosing West Berlin on all sides. Between them lay the death strip, a wide, open zone designed to stop anyone from crossing. It was raked flat so footprints showed. The ground was often covered with fine sand or gravel. Floodlights lit it at night, and tripwires could trigger alarms. Patrol roads let guards move quickly. Watchtowers rose at regular intervals, 302 in all, giving soldiers a clear view along the 155-kilometer perimeter. Armed patrols, dogs on wire runs, and vehicle traps made escape extremely difficult. For East Berliners, the wall was a daily presence. Many could see it from their homes or workplaces. Its concrete face was blank, topped with a rounded pipe to make climbing harder. Approaching it without permission was dangerous. Guards were trained to give warnings, but could use deadly force if someone tried to cross. Signs in red letters marked the restricted zone. The death strip itself was off limits except for soldiers and maintenance crews. Life in West Berlin continued in a very different way. People there could walk right up to the wall, take photographs, or paint graffiti on its western face. For them, it was a symbol of division, but also a backdrop to normal city life. Tourists came to see it, standing on viewing platforms to look into the east. Still, for West Berliners with family in the east, the wall was a constant reminder of separation. Visits were rare and heavily controlled. Both governments used the wall in their propaganda. In the West, it was called the Wall of Shame, proof that the East had to imprison its own people to keep them from leaving. Western newspapers carried stories of daring escapes and tragic deaths. In the East, the government called it the anti-fascist protective barrier. State media said it was built to defend socialism from Western spies, saboteurs, and the threat of a new war. Official tours took visitors along the wall, showing them watchtowers and explaining the danger from the West. Behind these political messages were personal stories of loss and separation. Families were split overnight in August 1961. A mother might be trapped in the East while her children stayed with relatives in the West. Brothers and sisters found themselves on opposite sides, unable to visit except by applying for special permits that were often refused. Birthdays, weddings, and funerals happened without the presence of loved ones. People sent letters that sometimes arrived months later, if at all, and knew that phone calls could be monitored. Some refused to accept the wall as final. In the first years after it was built, many tried to escape. Some dug tunnels from cellars or basements in the West under the death strip into the East. These tunnels were narrow, dark, and often wet, but they provided a way out for dozens at a time. Others swam across canals or rivers that formed part of the border, braving cold water, strong currents, and the risk of being seen by guards. One famous escape used a hot air balloon. In 1979, two East German families built a homemade balloon from cloth and gas burners. They launched it at night and drifted across the border to land safely in the West. In another case, an acrobat walked along a high-tension cable strung over the border. Some hid inside modified cars, squeezed into hollowed-out compartments, or beneath false floors. Not all attempts succeeded. Many were caught and arrested, facing long prison sentences. Others were killed. The first known fatality was Ida Siekmann, who died trying to jump from her third-floor window into West Berlin just days after the wall went up. The most famous was perhaps Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old shot by guards in 1962 as he tried to climb the wall. He fell into the death strip, where he lay bleeding for nearly an hour before dying. Western onlookers could see him, but could not help without crossing into East German territory. There were also moments of rescue. In some cases, West Berlin fire brigades stretched ladders across the border to help people trapped in buildings on the east side before they could be sealed. Allied military patrols sometimes intervened when East German guards chased escapees into the western sectors. These incidents were rare, and each was followed by tighter controls from the east. The wall became part of everyday language in Berlin. People used expressions like living in the shadow to describe life under its constant presence. Children in the East learned in school that the barrier kept them safe from fascist threats, while children in the West were told it was a prison wall. In both cases, the wall shaped their sense of the world. Its design evolved over time. The first concrete wall was replaced in the 1970s by a higher, reinforced version known as the Grenzmauer 75. This model stood 3.6 meters tall, with a smooth concrete surface and a rounded top. It was built to be harder to climb and to resist damage. The death strip was widened in places, and new floodlights and sensors were added. Each improvement made escape riskier. Despite the danger, attempts never stopped entirely. Every successful escape was celebrated in the West, often with press conferences and photographs. In the East, such news was suppressed, and failed attempts were portrayed as examples of Western manipulation. Yet stories traveled by word of mouth, sometimes inspiring others to try. For those who stayed, life meant adjusting to restrictions. East Berliners needed official permission to visit relatives in the West, and such visits were usually allowed only for major family events, often limited to pensioners. West Berliners could visit the east but faced searches and inspections at the checkpoints. Everyone crossing had to show papers, and guards could refuse entry without explanation. The wall also shaped the city's geography. Neighborhoods once connected by streets and tram lines were cut in two. Some stations in the east, on subway lines operated by the west, became ghost stations, closed to the public but staffed by guards. Trains slowed but did not stop, and passengers could see dimly lit platforms with armed soldiers as they passed through. In both East and West Berlin, the wall was a constant fact of life, visible and unavoidable. It was concrete and steel, propaganda and politics, separation and defiance. It was the backdrop for ordinary routines and extraordinary acts, a barrier that shaped the lives of millions who lived in its shadow. The Berlin Wall was the physical form of what Winston Churchill had called the Iron Curtain. It made visible the split between two systems that claimed to represent the future. On one side stood the capitalist democracies of the West. On the other stood the communist states led by the Soviet Union. Berlin, divided but still one city, became a place where this global divide could be seen in a single street, a single checkpoint, or a single strip of concrete. The Cold War was fought without direct battles between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it was not without conflict. Nuclear weapons stood ready on both sides, and the threat of their use shaped every decision. Berlin's position made it a potential flashpoint. If war broke out in Europe, the city could be one of the first places where the superpowers met in combat. Each confrontation at the checkpoints carried a risk that it might spiral into something larger. Espionage was a constant feature. Berlin was full of intelligence agents from many countries using the city's position to collect information. The proximity of East and West made it easier for spies to meet contacts, pass documents, and observe military activity. Both sides ran operations to recruit informants across the border. Some worked in embassies, others in factories or rail stations. The wall reduced casual crossings, but it did not end espionage. Tunnel systems used for escapes were sometimes used to install listening devices or tap communications cables. Beyond Berlin, the Cold War played out in proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and other parts of the world. The superpowers backed opposing sides, providing weapons, money, and training. These distant conflicts were linked to Berlin in speeches and propaganda. The West argued that defending the city was part of defending freedom everywhere. The East claimed that protecting Berlin's socialist sector was part of resisting imperialism worldwide. The wall became a cultural symbol as well as a political one. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin. Standing before the Rathaus Schöneberg, he addressed a crowd of hundreds of thousands. His most famous words, "Ich bin ein Berliner," were meant to express solidarity, telling the city's people that their struggle was shared by all free nations. The speech was carried on radio and television around the world, reinforcing the idea that Berlin stood on the front line of freedom. In the East, Kennedy's visit was treated as a show of Western propaganda. East German state media dismissed it as empty rhetoric. Yet even in the East, some listened to foreign broadcasts or heard reports from relatives in the West. The speech became part of the city's history, remembered as a moment when the world's attention was focused on Berlin. The wall also appeared in films, books, and music. Western artists used it to represent division, oppression, or the human cost of political conflict. Photographs of the graffiti-covered Western side, with slogans, paintings, and political statements, became iconic. In contrast, the Eastern side remained bare and closely guarded. For East German authorities, the wall was not to be celebrated but accepted as a necessary security measure. In the decades after Kennedy's visit, the Cold War entered new phases. Détente in the 1970s brought some easing of tensions, including agreements that allowed more family visits across the border. But mistrust remained. The arms race continued, with both sides developing new missiles and defense systems. Berlin stayed under tight control, its crossings regulated by detailed procedures. In the 1980s, the rhetoric sharpened again. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan came to West Berlin and spoke near the Brandenburg Gate, within sight of the wall. Addressing Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The line was a direct challenge, delivered at a time when the Soviet Union was beginning to change under policies of glasnost and perestroika. The speech was met with loud applause in the West, while the East dismissed it as another example of Western provocation. Between Kennedy's declaration and Reagan's challenge, the wall had remained unchanged in its purpose. It stopped the flow of people and stood as a symbol of control. Yet the world around it had shifted. The nuclear arms race had produced weapons far more powerful than those of the early 1960s. The superpowers had fought and withdrawn from wars in Asia. Political movements in Eastern Europe had grown, challenging one-party rule in ways that were harder to suppress. For visitors from abroad, the wall was a place to take in the reality of the Cold War at close range. Diplomats, journalists, and tourists came to see the checkpoints and watchtowers. They photographed the stark division, the soldiers on each side, and the signs warning of the border. For many, the experience brought home the scale of the ideological divide in a way that speeches and newspapers could not. In both East and West, schoolchildren learned about the wall from official perspectives. In West Berlin classrooms, it was taught as a barrier to freedom. In the East, it was described as a shield against fascism and foreign interference. These lessons shaped how each generation understood the city's place in the world. The wall's presence influenced diplomacy far beyond Germany. In arms talks, trade negotiations, and United Nations debates, Berlin was often mentioned as proof of the other side's intentions. For the West, it showed that the Soviet Union relied on force to keep its allies in line. For the East, it proved that the West sought to undermine socialism from within. The contrast between the two Berlins was clear to anyone who crossed at an official checkpoint. On one side, neon signs, shop displays, and busy streets. On the other, quieter roads, fewer goods in stores, and state-controlled billboards. These differences reinforced the narratives each side told about the other. Visitors could see them without explanation. The wall was not just a local or national boundary. It was a marker in the global competition between two systems. Every speech, every photograph, and every confrontation at its edge fed into the larger Cold War story. The concrete and barbed wire in Berlin stood for more than a city divided. It stood for a world split into two camps, each convinced of its own vision for the future. By the late 1980s, the Cold War was changing. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev had risen to power and begun reforms. Glasnost, or openness, allowed more discussion and criticism in public life. Perestroika, or restructuring, aimed to improve the economy by loosening state control. These changes did not end Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, but they signaled a softer approach. Gorbachev also made clear that the Soviet Union would not use force to keep its allies in line, as it had in the past. This new attitude encouraged movements for change across the Eastern Bloc. In East Germany, the government under Erich Honecker resisted reform. The Socialist Unity Party still controlled politics, the press, and the borders. Yet East Germans were watching events in neighboring countries. In Poland, the Solidarity movement had won political concessions. In Hungary, border controls with Austria had eased, and some East Germans traveled there to slip into the West. The idea that the Iron Curtain might not be permanent was spreading. Protests began to grow inside East Germany. In Leipzig, weekly Monday demonstrations gathered outside St. Nicholas Church. At first small, they swelled into tens of thousands of people, calling for more freedoms, free elections, and the right to travel. Demonstrations spread to other cities, including East Berlin. The government sent police and security forces to watch and intimidate, but mass violence risked disaster. The memory of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China earlier that year was fresh in people's minds, and East German leaders feared global condemnation if they used similar force. By the autumn of 1989, the pressure was visible. Honecker resigned in October, replaced by Egon Krenz, who promised change but moved slowly. At the same time, thousands of East Germans were leaving through legal loopholes, especially via Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Crowds outside West German embassies in Eastern Europe demanded passage to the West. The GDR leadership needed a plan to manage the growing crisis. On November 9, 1989, the government announced new travel regulations. The idea was to allow controlled, limited crossings with proper permits, hoping to calm public anger. That evening, Günter Schabowski, a senior party official, held a press conference to explain the changes. He had not been fully briefed. Reading from his notes, he said that East Germans could apply for private travel abroad without special reason, and that the new rules would take effect immediately. Reporters asked if this meant people could go through the border crossings right away. Schabowski, looking uncertain, replied, "As far as I know, yes." His words went out live on television and radio. Viewers across East Germany heard them and assumed the wall was open. Within an hour, people began walking toward the checkpoints. At Bornholmer Strasse in Berlin, the first to arrive were cautious, asking guards if they could cross. The border officers had no clear orders. As the crowd grew into the hundreds and then thousands, the situation became tense. Guards called their superiors, but no one wanted to take responsibility for firing on civilians. Just before midnight, facing a surging crowd, the commander at Bornholmer Strasse ordered the gates opened. People poured through into West Berlin. Word spread quickly. Other crossings followed as guards, unsure what else to do, opened their gates as well. By midnight, streams of East Berliners were entering the West, greeted by cheers, embraces, and music. Some crossed on foot, others in cars, waving from open windows. West Berliners handed out flowers, champagne, and beer. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered at the wall itself, climbing onto its top in defiance of decades of rules. Television cameras broadcast the scenes worldwide. Families reunited after years apart. Young people danced on the wall. Strangers hugged in the streets. At the Brandenburg Gate, people clambered up and stood on the broad top of the wall, looking out over both sides of the city. Police stood by, no longer trying to enforce the old restrictions. As the night went on, some began to chip away at the concrete. Using hammers, chisels, and even screwdrivers, they broke off small pieces to keep as souvenirs. These wall peckers worked under floodlights, surrounded by crowds cheering each blow. Graffiti already covered the western side, but now it became covered with fresh marks made in celebration. In the following days, more official openings took place. Checkpoints that had been heavily guarded for decades became busy crossings for pedestrians, cyclists, and cars. Long lines formed at newly opened gates. East Germans visited the West to shop, meet relatives, and simply walk through streets they had not seen in years. Many returned home the same day, carrying gifts, food, and Western newspapers. Others stayed, starting new lives. Demolition crews moved in to take down larger sections. This time the work was sanctioned, and both sides participated. Cranes lifted heavy slabs of concrete, exposing the death strip, which quickly filled with people walking freely for the first time. Watchtowers that had once housed armed guards were dismantled or left as empty shells. The barrier that had defined Berlin for 28 years was disappearing. The fall of the wall did not happen in isolation. It was part of a wave of change sweeping Eastern Europe. In the weeks before, communist governments in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia had given way to reform or collapse. The East German government, once one of the most rigid in the bloc, could no longer hold back the tide. In Berlin, the mood in those first days after November 9th was a mix of disbelief and joy. Many had lived their entire adult lives with the wall in place and could hardly imagine the city without it. Children from the East stared at the neon lights and crowded shops of the West. West Berliners visited the East with a sense of curiosity about streets that had been just out of reach. The wall's fall also drew visitors from abroad. Tourists arrived to see the place where history had turned, to walk along streets that had been closed, and to touch the broken sections of concrete. Street musicians played near the remaining fragments, and vendors sold small pieces said to be from the wall itself. By the end of 1989, large gaps stood where the wall had been solid. The death strip, once a place of fear, became a path for cyclists and walkers. Graffiti artists painted the remaining sections with messages of peace and unity. The symbols of division were being remade into symbols of change. When the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, the next question was what to do with two Germanys that had been separated for 4 decades. Politically, the momentum was toward unity. In the months that followed, leaders from East and West Germany began talks on how to merge their governments, economies, and legal systems. The process moved quickly. By October 3, 1990, the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist, and its territory joined the Federal Republic of Germany. Berlin became the capital of the united country. Merging two very different systems was not simple. West Germany had a market economy with private ownership, competition, and integration into the global trading system. East Germany had a state-run economy where most industries and farms were publicly owned. Many East German factories were outdated and could not compete in open markets. The government created the Treuhand Agency to privatize or close these state enterprises. Some were sold to investors from the West, others shut down entirely. Large numbers of workers lost their jobs, and unemployment in the East rose sharply. The West poured billions of marks into rebuilding infrastructure in the East: roads, railways, power systems, and public buildings. Housing was renovated, and new businesses were encouraged to open. The Deutsche Mark replaced the East German mark as the national currency, giving East Germans more purchasing power, but also making many local goods uncompetitive overnight. Prices for consumer items rose, and some people felt they had traded economic stability for uncertainty. Politically, reunification meant extending West Germany's constitution, legal system, and institutions into the East. Courts, police, and government offices were restructured. Elections were held under the same rules nationwide. For many East Germans, these changes brought new freedoms: freedom of speech, assembly, and travel, but also a loss of familiar structures. Organizations that had shaped daily life in the GDR, from trade unions to youth groups, disappeared or were transformed. Social integration proved harder than political or economic merger. People who had lived under the GDR's system often felt their experience was undervalued. Skills they had built in state-run industries did not always transfer easily into the new economy. West Germans sometimes saw the East as backward or inefficient, while East Germans sometimes viewed the West as arrogant or insensitive. These attitudes created an invisible wall of stereotypes and mistrust. Generational differences played a role. Younger East Germans adapted more easily to the new system, finding work in Western companies or moving to other parts of Germany. Older generations sometimes struggled with the pace of change. Pension rules shifted, familiar shops closed, and entire neighborhoods altered character as investment poured in. Some people felt they had lost not only their jobs, but also their sense of belonging. Over time, many disparities narrowed, but some remain. Average incomes in the East are still lower than in the West, and unemployment rates tend to be higher. In politics, certain parties draw stronger support in the East, reflecting different priorities and historical experiences. These differences do not mean the country is divided in the same way as before, but they show how deeply separation shaped lives. Remembering the wall became an important task for the new Germany. Much of it was quickly dismantled after 1989, but certain sections were preserved as memorials. The Berlin Wall Memorial on Bernauer Straße keeps a stretch of the original barrier, including the death strip and watchtower, to show visitors how it once looked. Photographs, exhibits, and personal stories tell of those who lived and died in its shadow. The East Side Gallery is another landmark. Here, more than a kilometer of the wall's eastern face remains, covered with paintings by artists from around the world. Some works are abstract, others depict political messages or scenes of joy from the wall's fall. Over time, the murals have been restored and repainted, turning the site into both an art space and a historical record. Museums across Berlin document the wall's history. The Checkpoint Charlie Museum displays escape devices, photographs, and accounts of life in divided Berlin. The Stasi Museum shows how East Germany's secret police monitored the population. Smaller local museums focus on neighborhood experiences, preserving letters, household items, and oral histories from residents. Plaques and markers trace where the wall once stood. In central Berlin, a double row of cobblestones runs along streets and sidewalks, following the wall's former path. Tourists and residents walk over it daily, a reminder that the city once had a line cutting through its heart. Some of the old watchtowers have been preserved, others serve as lookout points or small exhibitions. Public memory of the wall is shaped by personal experience. For some, it recalls oppression and lost opportunities. For others, it is a story of courage and endurance. School children who never saw the wall in place Learn about it through textbooks, museum visits, and conversations with older relatives. Films and documentaries keep the events alive for new generations, often using personal stories to show the impact of political decisions on ordinary lives. Art and literature continue to engage with the wall's legacy. Novels explore the moral choices faced by those who lived under surveillance. Photographers document the wall's remnants and the spaces it once divided. Theater productions and exhibitions use the wall as a symbol for borders and barriers elsewhere in the world. These creative works keep the history relevant, connecting it to broader questions about freedom, security, and human rights. In Berlin today, it is possible to stand at the Brandenburg Gate and see no trace of the wall that once made it inaccessible. Cafes and shops fill streets that were once empty zones patrolled by guards. Yet a short walk in certain neighborhoods reveals fragments of concrete still standing, weathered and scarred, often covered with graffiti from both the past and the present. They are physical reminders of a period when the city and the world was divided in ways that shaped every aspect of life. The Berlin Wall was not the only barrier to divide people. Around the world, other lines on maps have been made solid with fences, walls, or military zones. These barriers vary in purpose and form, but they share certain effects: separation of families, restriction of movement, and the creation of a physical reminder of political conflict. On the Korean Peninsula, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, marks the border between North and South Korea. It was established in 1953 at the end of the Korean War, not as a step toward unity, but as a buffer to prevent renewed fighting. The DMZ is about 250 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide, running roughly along the 38th parallel. Despite its name, it is one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world. Armed soldiers, minefields, fences, and guard posts line both sides. Like the Berlin Wall, the DMZ divides people who share a common history and language. Families were separated when the border was sealed, often without any chance to see or speak to each other again. Occasional reunion programs have been arranged, allowing elderly relatives to meet briefly, but these are rare and controlled. Unlike Berlin, where people could once cross fairly freely before the wall was built, movement across the DMZ has been almost impossible since its creation. The barrier's scale and military presence make escape attempts extremely rare. The DMZ also reflects a deeper ideological split. North Korea is a tightly controlled one-party state with a command economy. South Korea is a capitalist democracy. Both governments use the border as a political symbol. In the North, it is presented as protection against foreign aggression. In the South, it is shown as a reminder of the need for vigilance and a desire for eventual reunification. The parallels with the Berlin Wall are clear, but the differences are also important. The DMZ is a wide buffer zone created after a major war, not a wall through a single city. It has existed for decades without the kind of mass public protests that eventually brought down the Berlin Wall, in part because the military and political situation on the peninsula is more rigid. Another example is the Green Line in Cyprus. In 1974, following a coup by Greek nationalists and a military intervention by Turkey, the island was divided into the Republic of Cyprus in the south and the Turkish-controlled north. The United Nations established the Green Line as a buffer zone. It runs for more than 180 kilometers, cutting through farmland, villages, and even the capital city, Nicosia. Like the Berlin Wall, the Green Line has areas where buildings stand abandoned, left as they were in 1974. Streets end in barricades, and crossing points are controlled by checkpoints. For decades, movement between the two sides was almost entirely banned. In 2003, some crossing points opened, allowing people to visit family homes, attend events, or simply see the other side for the first time in years. Even with these openings, the political division remains unresolved. The Green Line is less fortified than the DMZ or the Berlin Wall, but its effect on daily life has been similar, separating communities and shaping political identity. Walls have also been built in earlier times for different purposes. The Great Wall of China, for example, was not meant to divide a single people or ideology, but to defend against invasions from the north. Construction began more than 2,000 years ago and continued in stages over many dynasties. The wall's length, size, and strategic placement made it a formidable barrier for armies, but it was not continuous in the modern sense. Gaps existed, and the wall was part of a broader defense system, including forts, watchtowers, and garrisons. The Great Wall's role was military and territorial rather than ideological, yet it also shaped the sense of identity inside its borders. It marked the edge of a political and cultural sphere, much as later walls would define lines between nations or systems. Unlike Berlin or the DMZ, the Great Wall did not stop people from leaving or reuniting with family, but it did serve as a visible limit of control and protection. Looking across these examples, certain lessons emerge. Physical barriers can be built quickly but have long-lasting effects. They change patterns of life, from where people work and shop to how they see their neighbors. Once in place, they are hard to remove, not only because of the concrete or barbed wire, but because of the political interests invested in keeping them. Barriers are also powerful symbols. They can be used to rally support, as in official speeches about defending the homeland, or to criticize an opponent, as in portrayals of a wall as a prison. In both cases, the structure becomes more than a line on the ground. It becomes a focus for identity, loyalty, and opposition. This symbolic weight means that even when barriers fall, their presence lingers in memory and in the way people think about the other side. The Berlin Wall, the DMZ, the Green Line, and the Great Wall each show different aspects of how walls function. Some are meant to stop armies, others to control populations. Some are part of unresolved conflicts, others have become historical landmarks. All share a role in shaping the way people understand borders, not just as lines drawn by treaties, but as lived realities that can define daily life for generations. The human cost of division shows in small scenes: a chair at a table that stays empty year after year, a letter that arrives with stamps from two systems and speaks in guarded words, a child who learns the route to school by the turn in a wall rather than by a bridge, a worker who hears a familiar voice across a barrier and cannot answer. Borders do not only mark land, they train habits. They shape speech, choices, and even the stories families tell. In Berlin, the wall turned neighbors into shadows. It set grief into a timetable and told people to measure love in permits and stamps. Loss traveled both ways. In the East, families missed birthdays, weddings, and funerals. In the West, people felt the gap as a daily ache. The split rewired work and school. Some jobs vanished because the route to them was gone. A nurse could see the hospital where she once worked, yet had to take a new job because a line now lay between her and the ward. A musician who had shared a stage with friends across town now played to a new crowd and wondered what the old one sounded like. The wall also pressed on those who enforced it. A guard lived with orders that set him against his own language and streets. He stood in a tower and watched faces that looked like his own. He lived with the risk of escalation. A mistake at a gate could move up the chain into a crisis. The checkpoint was a workplace, but the tools of that work, searchlights, dog runs, signal flares, carried moral weight. Why do walls rise? Fear is one answer. Leaders fear revolt, rivals, and flight. A state that loses people loses skills, taxes, and pride. In Berlin, the exit option through the city bled the east of trained labor and future managers. Walls also rise from the security dilemma. One side fortifies to feel safe, the other reads a threat and fortifies in turn. Each step hardens the border. There is also the logic of control. A permit regime grants power to the office that stamps the paper. Files pile up. Terms like internal migration, temporary transit, and special case turn lives into categories. Bureaucracy casts itself as neutral, but it changes fate. Walls also feed on stories. Propaganda gives each new layer of concrete a reason to exist. One side calls the barrier a shield, the other names it a cage. The words seep into lessons at school, radio shows, and street posters. Over time, the story hardens as much as the concrete. People learn where they can speak and where they must stay silent. They learn that some maps hang in homes for hope rather than for guidance. Why do walls fall? Power shifts. Money runs thin. Elites split. A generation grows that does not feel bound by old fears. Ideas leap across borders by signal, cassette, fax, and face-to-face talk. A misstep by a spokesman can tip a balance set by years of pressure. None of this is pure chance. People test limits in marches, petitions, and small acts. A pastor opens a church door. A factory crew decides to talk after a shift. A border captain chooses not to fire. These moves look small at the time. Together, they change the cost of holding the line. The fall of a wall does not erase the damage. It exposes it. When people cross again, they see what time took. Streets do not match. Schools teach with different books. Paychecks, pensions, and prices sit on different scales. Those who stayed carry a record of choices that made sense at the time. Those who left carry a record of loss and gain in new cities and new work. Reunions bring joy, but they also bring the hard talk of who did what and why. Berlin's story guides how we look at barriers in other places. Some borders try to stop armies. Others try to stop families. Some draw a clear line across empty land. Others cut through living streets and kitchens. A hard border brings a kind of order, but it also traps conflict in daily routines. It creates frontline communities that live with checks, searches, and the risk of sudden closure. It normalizes watchtowers and floodlights. It makes the exception feel like the rule. Walls also move from the ground to the mind. A person learns to avoid a street, then a subject, then a set of friends. Self-censorship grows from the same soil as barbed wire. A wall teaches distance. It says, "Do not ask," and then a person stops asking. The inverse is true too. When the wall comes down, people need time to learn to ask again. There are ways to soften harm, even when a barrier stays. Humanitarian corridors, red lines on use of force, clear appeals processes, and third-party monitors can reduce risk. Simple design choices help. Clear signage, translation at gates, family visit windows that match school and work schedules, safe footpaths that keep people from water or rails. None of these end the split. They admit that human life flows through and around concrete and wire. Memory is also a form of care. Sites that keep a trace of the barrier teach scale and scar without glamour. A section of wall, a watchtower shell, a row of cobblestones where concrete stood, these let people place themselves in the old map. Museums that center personal files, letters, and tools show how systems touch bodies and homes. Art on old slabs can honor grief and wit without erasing the weight of the thing itself. The story reaches beyond borders of cement. Today, screens and feeds can sort people into echo chambers that feel like walls. These are not patrol roads, but they narrow sight. The fix is not a new barrier, but contact, shared spaces, shared facts, and work that crosses lines. Berlin reminds us that contact is not an extra, it is the oxygen of civic life. In the end, a wall is a bet by a government that control can outlast desire. Desire to move, to speak, to link work and family across space. For a time, the bet can pay. Trains stop, streets close, papers rule, then gaps open, first in the story, then in the concrete. Faces crowd a gate, a hinge swings. A city breathes in. The sound is not the fall of an empire. It is the sound of feet on a bridge that had been missing from the map.